So if you just came on, wishing everyone a good morning. We're going to be doing the chant from the Common Ground Chant book on page 26, 5 subjects for frequent recollection. And after the guided sit today, I'm going to be talking about humility as an enlivening and liberating, even empowering way forward in our lives, to learn how to ground into the actual experience of humility. And this chant is actually a real support for opening with that understanding of humility, knowing that we don't know, in other words. And it's because these 5 recollections the Buddha recommends we bring to mind, we reflect on daily, they interrupt a lot of fixed ideas that death is something that happens to other people. Illness, aging, loss. When things are going relatively well for us, there's a common delusion that creeps in that somehow we're immune to difficulties. And we can instead cultivate this wisdom of knowing that we don't know, and knowing that really anything can happen anytime. And we don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. And that's not just in terms of difficult or bad things, but even really good things. We don't know. Who knows? So let's do this chant, and you'll see at the bottom of the chant on page 26 the word kama, which is the Pali equivalent of the Sanskrit word karma, which you're probably familiar with. Karma or kama just means intentional action. Actions, including thoughts and speech, actions done with intention, leave an impression. And that's really what that last piece is about. So let's do the chant together, and then we'll sit together for about 35 minutes. 5 subjects for frequent recollection. I am of the nature to age. I have not gone beyond aging. I am of the nature to sicken. I have not gone beyond sickness. I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond dying. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. I am the owner of my karma, heir to my karma, born of my karma, related to my karma, abide supported by my karma. Whatever karma I shall do, for good or for ill, of that I will be the heir. Thus we should frequently recollect. So let's just settle in, listen to your body, notice the effects on our heart. And we can begin our sitting time with the eyes open or the eyes lightly closed, whatever feels helpful. But we can begin with this sense of humility. So it's not so much of me beginning my meditation practice, in a sense, arrogantly sure I know what I'm doing, but rather more of a settling in to the experience of sitting here now. So the only certainty is there is this body, it feels like this. And right here with the body, there is this sensitive heart, this feeling heart. And I care enough to be present, to have an honest and open way of relating to this life that's showing up. I don't want to live pretending that I know what this is. So I'm going to be willing to practice being open. One of my teachers, someone that many of you have read from, Sayadaw U Tejaniya, this Burmese teacher, that has been quite influential these last 20 years in the Western early Buddhism or insight meditation scene. And he talks about this tendency to rush into our practice. And he says, practitioners are too busy thinking they are practicing. They need to step back in order to see what is happening. They need to switch from doing to recognizing. So let's take that up now as we simply recognize our lived experience, quality of the body, the quality of the heart and mind, and this willingness to be, in a sense, exposed or even vulnerable to the way it is in the body, the way it is in the heart and mind. And we're cultivating a non-contentious relationship with what is real, what is showing up now. So a willingness to relax and allow instead of some idea of needing to control or needing to fix. And we're just wondering in this open, this humble place, wondering, is it safe just to allow my life, this activity of my body, this activity of my heart and mind, is it safe simply to allow my life to unfold, to meet it with this openness, this clear and kind presence? Is it safe to relax, to soften a little? Including softening around any place, any experience that feels hard or held tight. Well, I can soften with that. I can open, acknowledge that. So with each inhalation, we can use that, the archetype of breathing in, as a kind of beautiful acceptance and curiosity and openness, as if the heart, the wise heart says, yes, this is how it is right now in the body and the mind. Yes, And then with each exhalation, let it be an archetype of allowing, surrender, trusting of nature, the natural unfolding. So if it helps to have a word, then you can repeat the word yes with each in-breath and the word allowing with each out-breath. And of course, you can come up with your own phrase or word, but keep it simple. And these meditation words or meditation phrases are just supports so that we're learning how to relate to the activity of the present moment with more wisdom, more humility, more kindness, more openness. So if you don't have any clarity, just use yes as you breathe in and allowing conditions to be as you breathe out, or just the word allowing. And we'll continue in silence now for a while. So be willing to begin again and again. And we're exploring this quality of the heart we call humility, knowing that we don't know. So in that sense, the heart, the mind is open in the receiving, the connecting with experience, open to allow things to unfold as they do. So instead of me being the meditator meditating, it's much more about sustaining the sense of humility and openness, curiosity, sensitivity, which is really an expression of kindness. And even if we have real doubt about our practice, we know that although I may not know much, I know it's helpful to show up, to be aware, and I know it's helpful to be kind. And that's a powerful start. And for the last 4 minutes or so, you might find it helpful to practice with the eyes open. And we don't have to come to any conclusion as we just do our best to open to the sitting body and the thinking mind, the feeling heart, and just give permission for everything to move, to come and go. So wisdom, the nature of wisdom and love is they know how to hold space for this ordinary activity of body and mind, not confused by what's being felt and experienced. In this way, we ventilate life, we could say, including sadness and grief and joy and excitement. Wisdom and love brings this vast space that can include everything. So do your best to experiment for these last few minutes. And if you can, sensing that the heart, the mind and body, that to some degree at least is unfixed, which is what we mean by being open. It's that willingness for any fixedness, that willingness to let go, to not be dependent on being tight or certain, but instead this willingness to be open. And right before we began our sit today, Sherry wrote something in the chat about a recent loss of her husband. And thanks for being willing to share that with us, Sherry, and I appreciate people responding. And this is a wonderful time to just do our best to hold that experience of loss that Shelley is talking about, that Sherry is talking about. The one thing for sure is we know, as probably Sherry's experiencing, we know that we experience the pain of loss. Something was here and now it's not here anymore, and the heart hurts. And I care about that pain, care about Sherry's pain, however that might be. and the wider pain of loss that so many of us have experienced and are experiencing. And also just holding that sense of humility around these passings, somebody living and then dying. And what we know is that we really don't know. We know the body falls apart and ceases to exist. And that's about all we know with certainty. So just having an open mind and letting love flow in. So for Sherry's husband and for all those who have passed, may whatever is next, may your heart open skillfully to whatever's next in your life or lives. May wisdom and love guide your way. May you be at ease. And when you're ready, begin to move the body in a comfortable way. And I mentioned today, I thought it might be nice, the last couple of weeks, talking about the middle way and recognizing more clearly, with more wisdom, that dichotomy or duality between domination and helplessness. And so, in a sense, in the same thing, just really understanding how to recognize humility and how to see humility not as a kind of passivity, but really an empowering way forward. In a way, the actual experience of humility, that attitude, knowing that I don't know, right? You see, it really is conducive to being open. And in being open, in a maybe ironic way, we find our way forward, right? Because so much of what blocks us in just ordinary senses, like what causes us to have a stuck relationship with another human being, or caught up in fear, or caught up in this way or that way, is some version of an arrogant certainty where our mind is really fixed on what it thinks it knows. So it's really useful to reflect on the letting go or the going beyond that fixedness, that certainty, that arrogant certainty. And I know that a teacher once said, Shokni Rinpoche, somebody I've studied with a little bit at least, and he has this short phrase, to let go requires a tiny miracle. And I think what he means by that letting go is really a miracle, is it isn't something that you or I can do. Letting go happens, right? We've all probably experienced moments where the heart felt experience being bound up and there was a letting go, a releasing of that. And it's useful to remember those times and in a way to reform any story, because we might casually tell ourselves and others a story that I let go of that. Oh yeah, I was really bound up with that idea or really caught up in that for a while, but then I let go of it. And that might be okay for casual conversation. But we, as a practitioner, somebody really interested in these teachings from the Buddha and this path of waking up, we want to really wake up to that experience, what we're calling letting go. What was it? And did I actually do it? Or was it something that happened naturally? And if it turns out to have been something that just happened, as Shokni Rinpoche, this Tibetan teacher, says, a little miracle, well, what were the supporting causes for that little miracle of letting go, of dropping the mind's attachment? What was it? Part of it is, living a life where we're getting really good at recognizing how holding to fixed views, expecting things to be a particular way, projecting our ideas on our lives and on the lives of others, over time, recognizing how that just doesn't work. I might have read this last week from Sayadaw U Tejaniya, this Burmese teacher, another teacher of mine. He says, there is no reason why you should stumble into nibbana, to this unbinding, this letting go of the heart. There's no reason why we should assume we're just going to bump into freedom, right? That freedom of our heart unbound. He writes, you have to pay a price. Only when the conditions are fulfilled will the effect come about. Be patient and work steadily. So nibbana isn't random. Waking up, the liberating, releasing, the putting down of unnecessary weight, that isn't something that just happens randomly. There are real supporting causes for it. It isn't right. It's too much to say that I should do it, and the fact that I haven't done it makes me a bad practitioner. That's personalizing it. But it's still waking up, just like suffering involves a natural process supporting conditions. The releasing of suffering involves a natural process and supporting conditions. And then our role as a practitioner isn't to do the letting go, but it's rather to understand, to see clearly, to comprehend deeply the supporting causes that are forward leading or onward leading in the direction of that deeper releasing of our heart, that opening of the heart. In one passage from the Buddha Suttas discourses that I read a lot, because it's so poignant, just the Buddha talking in such personal terms. Often that discourse gets translated as the thorn in your heart. And it's the Attadanda Sutta from the Sutta Nipata collection. This is a translation by Andrew Olensky, a wonderful Dharma teacher and scholar. And I won't read the whole discourse, but just this piece here, where he's talking about, looking around his own mind, the minds of others, as fish flopping around in water that's too shallow for the fish to swim. So that's a pretty graphic, pretty disturbing image, that kind of animal flopping around trying to get back to safety. And that's, a sensitive heart looking at the world, looking inward toward our own reactivity. That's what we see. So that's a pretty powerful experience the Buddha's having. And he writes here, or says, seeing this, I became afraid. This world completely lacks essence. It trembles in all directions. I long to find myself a place unscathed, but I could not see it. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. Now, remember a moment ago I was mentioning, and this just a very natural curiosity, I wonder what the supporting cause is for letting go, for this onward movement of humility, opening, seeing what we haven't seen, moving, the heart moving in the direction of release. Well, this is a really powerful, intense experience the Buddha's having. I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn. I discovered here a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions. So if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down. So in a way, using life and what presents itself in our lives, the beauty, the goodness, the pleasant experiences, and of course, the confusing and difficult experiences, And when we experience those, let's call them now difficult experience, we want to universalize it. See that what isn't just something that happens to me, it's just not me who right now feels betrayed by what's happening. But this uncertainty, this exposure to the pleasure and pain of life, this is a universal truth, right? So this is that distraught, oh, we human beings are right in the middle of this great churning. Another image, when the Buddha was talking to one of the kings at the time of the Buddha, and this person had become a friend and a student of the Buddha's, and was just complaining about how complicated it is being a king and how much insecurity there is and so many responsibilities. And the Buddha asked him, well, what do you do? How do you practice? And he says, that's the only thing to do, is to do Dharma practice. And the Buddha really liked his response and said, yes, it's as if 4 great mountain ranges are marching towards you, one from the east, one from the west, one from the north, one from the south, and they're marching toward. And instead of, practicing distraction and denial, or freaking out and somehow thinking I'm going to beat this, I'll build a fort that will keep the mountains out. Well, the whole idea of that image is there's nothing you can do when you have 4 great mountain ranges marching towards you, except to practice, right? And this is the thing, we want to see that subtle thorn stuck deep in the heart. And so right in the middle of difficulty, right in the middle of beautiful things happening in our lives, we want to discern, well, what is that thorn? And I think one way you can think about this and use to help recognize those thorns, that thorn in our heart, is the absence of humility. In Buddhism, we have personality view or wrong view, fixed view, attachment, identification, grasping, clinging. We have these different related terms that really point to that thorn in the heart. And it's totally, when we recognize our mind, our heart clinging, grasping, being fixed or fixated, being identified, being attached to some view. It shouldn't be a cause to hate ourselves or to judge ourselves. Instead, our response, the wise and kind response, is something like, well, of course you're clinging to this view. Of course you're pretending to be certain about this, hoping or wanting to be certain about this. Of course. Because as a sensitive being, seeing your life as a fish flopping with water too shallow, you're freaking out. And one way to handle that is to pretend you know more than you know. But it actually is a counterproductive move that we do all the time, all day long. We're using one fixed view after another, one identification, one arrogant certainty after another the heart clings to, just as a way of getting by, of sort of trying to hold our own against this deep truth of uncertainty, vulnerability. Anicca is the Pali word for change or impermanence, or the ephemeral, unreliable, ungovernable, unsatisfactory nature we have. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. These are the underlying characteristics that when we have a more honest, open, mindful awareness of the way it is, we see the changing, unsatisfying, impersonal nature. But we don't know what to do with that except to pretend that it ain't that way. But there is actually another way, which is to make peace, to open to anicca, dukkha, anatta. And this is really the way of humility, because there's no story, there's no conception, conceiving, idea, concept, scenario There's no way for me to construct a story of how I'm going to be safe with change and uncertainty and the deep unsatisfactoriness, ungovernableness, and impersonal nature. There's really no place for a separate self in reality. So we have to decide, are we going to be in allegiance with reality, or are we going to be in allegiance with this idea of a separate self that stands apart, that feels so lonely and so in need of solid ground, yet never finding it, right? What are we going to be in allegiance with? And another way of thinking of that, are we going to be in allegiance with reality as this mindful awareness sees it to be, or are we going to be in allegiance with the habits that have been passed down over and over again, generation by generation, self-view, self-centeredness, all the kind of egoic activities fueled or animated by greed and hate and different kinds of conceits. That really is our cultural legacy. We're infected generation after generation. And so it's our job to disinfect, to move beyond. And when we have little tastes of this, what the Buddha described, discerning that thorn, that deep habit of being dependent on a fixed view, thinking that my certainty, my idea of how it is, the way it is, my interpretation, my being right is going to save me, that I will be saved. And that just keeps us from the stream, from opening to the stream. I've been moved by this simple statement that I heard or read Ajahn Thanisaro, this Western Buddhist monk and wonderful scholar, sharing about one of his teachers, one of the Thai forest masters. I'm forgetting who said this, but basically the Dharma comment was, when you wake up to the freedom that comes with this deeper letting go, the letting go of attachment, the letting go of craving, the letting go of fixed self-view, it doesn't matter that the happiness you're opening to, the freedom you're opening to, isn't personal. There isn't anybody who has a problem with how impersonal that freedom is. The heart doesn't long for personal freedom, it longs for release. It doesn't really care sort of the nature of that release. There's something bound up that understands, that intuits the possibility of unbinding and letting go. This is a wonderful discourse. I just find it very accessible. The discourse on before breaking apart, or before the breakup of the body. And this is from the Sutta Nipata, I believe. Free of craving before their death, independent of past and future, not making up anything in the present, they revere nothing. Free of anger, free of fear, not boasting, not worrying, they are sages who, when speaking, teach without agitation, not clinging to the future, nor grieving the past. They see seclusion in the midst of sense contacts and are not guided by fixed views. They are neither clinging nor deceitful, not greedy or stingy, neither imprudent nor offensive, and don't engage in malicious speech. Always equanimous and mindful. In this world, they don't think of themselves as equal, superior, or inferior. They have no swollen pride. Depending on nothing, having known the Dharma the way it is, they are independent. They have no craving for becoming and non-becoming. I say they are at peace. They who are not concerned with sensual pleasures, they have no bonds and have crossed beyond attachments, taking nothing in the world as their own, having no sorrow for what doesn't exist, and uninvolved in doctrines or fixed views. They are called peaceful. So one of the most important working grounds, places for our practice is in this world of mental proliferation. The Pali word, as some of you know, is papancha. It's really one of those great words where the word itself sounds like what it means, right? Papancha sounds a little bit like that endless flitting about, endless diversification where one thought triggers several others, and on and on and on and on. And the Buddha uses this tendency, this expansive tendency of thinking, and how diversity, just the likes and dislikes, and how this is about that, how that is really an expression of this world of attachment. And the interesting thing, even with something as simple as touch, my hand touching my back of my other hand, initially, very quickly, the experience goes from, the warmth and the pressure of that contact to the mental interpretation. Oh, I'm touching the back of my hand. This is sort of a weird thing to do in the middle of a talk. Can they see it? What do they think about? Are they doing that? And on and on. Oh yeah, I'm noticing I have some age spots in the back of my hand these days. And on like that. Mental proliferation, right? But it's interesting if I train the attention to be interested in the physicality, the warmth, the pressure, the hardness of the touch, or the softness of the touch, or whatever the specific characteristics of this physical experience. I mean, it's interesting how doubt just disappears. Because doubt and likes and dislikes and that sort of endless proliferation of the thinking mind, it can be interrupted by simply connecting with things as they are. And, one of the ways we talk about it is just the mind being interested in the specific characteristics of the moment, not so much my mind's interpretation, the perception and its thoughts and liking or disliking of the feeling that comes with the perception, and on and on. And yet, of course, part of what fuels mental proliferation is this ignorant in the sense that it doesn't deliver what we think it's going to deliver. This ignorant sense that mental proliferation leads somewhere. Well, it does. It leads to more mental proliferation. But mental proliferation doesn't lead to some resolution of that inner tension. There is, if we're relatively settled, we'll know one of the things being relatively settled reveals is a deeper uneasiness, a deeper so-called restlessness in the heart. There's a sense, a pervasive sense of a somebody who needs safety, spiritual safety, somebody who needs something. And that kind of, it's that basic restlessness of life. And with human beings, with our more evolved language and capacity to think and imagine, we imagine that restlessness is a me that stands apart, that is exposed to this existential situation of being a living being, and that person, me, needs something. So we have ideas of heaven, we have ideas of salvation, we have ideas of the perfect marriage or perfect children that will bring me real satisfaction when they grow up and become the kind of person that I want them to be. we have ideas of the world, the way the world should be, and when it's that way, we'll feel safe, and when it's not that way, I feel anxious. But what we don't often have is a curiosity about that deeper sort of existential restlessness. That's the same thing, I think, as that thorn deep in the heart. And the way we generally address that uneasiness in the heart is through mental proliferation. We somehow think we can figure out what will put this uneasiness to rest. And that's why we think about things like God and salvation and heaven, and even, our way of thinking about the Buddhist teachings has a lot of that same flavor of being saved. There is something, me, that's unsettled, that is exposed, and I'll do this, and then I'll be saved. I'll be safe, and I will have done what I needed to do, and I can then, then I'll be free. But right now, I am exposed. I am vulnerable, and I don't like that. There's a me that doesn't like that. And there's this is the part that's unseen, an arrogant certainty that that interpretation is correct. So there's no humility about well, maybe that interpretation that is driving my life activity is off from the start. Maybe that's not the way to relate. This is from one of the senior Western monks in the Ajahn Chah tradition, Ajahn Dhammo. He writes, only awareness freed of self-interest can become an awareness which is bare, honest, objective, and non-judgmental. So it's really good for us, both in humorous ways and in discerning ways and loving ways. It's really good for us to get interested in the certainty, the absence of humility, and to really experiment with humility, almost like you're trying on a pair of clothes. Like, well, what would it look like? You're going into a meal with a friend, or you're going to hang out with your partner, or do some stuff with your kids, or play with your pet, or go to work, or get involved in some community activity. What would it be like for me to show up in that space with this knowing that I don't know? Right? So I'm not going to avoid engagement, but how I engage is going to be figured out moment by moment, because I know that I don't know. So then I'm going to be really sensitive, really intimate moment by moment, so that how I show up, what I say, what I don't say, it's going to not come from a fixed idea, thinking I know how I should show up here, but from just letting it rip, letting it play out little by little. I came across another thing from this website, Brain Pickings, Maria Popova's website, where she brings in just a lot of interesting articles. And I might have mentioned something from that website last week. And this is a poem by a woman who got cancer when they were 29 and then died before they were 40. And this person was not just a poet, but an astronomer as well. Her name was Rebecca Elson. And the poem, which is just the book of poetry, was A Responsibility to Awe, which is a great title for a book of poetry. A Responsibility to Awe. And the poem was Antidotes to Fear of Death. And the woman who read the poem is another astrophysicist, and ended her little sort of introduction to this poem with this wonderful reflection. We are all navigating the external world, but only through the prism of our own minds, our own subjective experience. The majesty of the universe is only ever conjured up in the mind. So that really begs the question, if we're always going to be living through our own constructions, the stories our mind constructs, what would be a useful story to be living through? And the suggestion today and with this talk is just a sense of humility, that our story that we're living through, that we're meeting the world with, is a story that involves humility as opposed to certainty. And that's just something we can very easily experiment with in our relationships. And just bring in that question, is whatever interpretation, whatever story I'm kind of using right now in my engagement with the world, does it have more the flavor of certainty or more the flavor of humility? Just that kind of curiosity is really enough. So here's the poem, Antidotes to the Fear of Death, right? Because it's surprising, this fear of death. It's like, for sure, I don't think anybody really knows what the dying process is. I mean, we've watched, if we're lucky, other people in the dying process, but I'm guessing none of us remember going through the dying process. So clearly, we should have some humility. But it's just interesting generally in the world how most of us, most of the time, have a very fixed idea of what death is. Even if it's simplistic, like death is bad, that's a fixed idea. How do we know? I mean, the pain before people die seems unfortunate to say the least, right? But we don't really know. So here's the poem. Sometimes, as an antidote to fear of death, I eat the stars. Those nights, lying on my back, I suck them from the quenching dark till they are all inside me, pepper hot and sharp. Sometimes, instead, I stir myself into a universe still young, still warm as blood, no outer space, just space, the light of all the not yet stars, drifting like a bright mist, and all of us and everything already there, but unconstrained by form. And sometime it's enough to lie down here on earth beside our long ancestral bones, to walk across the cobble fields of our discarded skulls like a treasure, like a chrysalis, thinking, whatever left these husks flew off on bright wings. Right? That's an interesting story that she paints with her poem about how to relate to death. To walk across the cobbled fields of our discarded skulls, right? Because we have a fixed idea of what that would be like. Like, that would not be cool. That would be very dark and very heavy. Each like a treasure, like a chrysalis, right? Like, well, maybe, who knows? Thinking, whatever left these husks flew off on bright wings. And it isn't about having a fixed view of like what happens at the time of the death. Oh, we're just reborn, depending on our behavior in this life, we get another life. And right, that maybe it's slightly better fixed view to have. But just what would it be like to just be open? And the only ground we have is we know that we don't know. And that remaining open, remaining unfixed, really lends itself to this kind presence, this mindful awareness. And it's so interesting to see how things naturally just start working better the more we abide in that way, in that place of openness. One way to think about humility is it just wears, the more we trust it, it wears everything else down. And one of my favorite similes the Buddha uses, I might have mentioned it recently, is how weather sun, humidity, rain, wind, how it wears the rigging, the sails and ropes on a boat. This is the quote here from the discourse. Just as when an ocean-going ship rigged with masts and stays after 6 months on the water is left on shore for the winter, its stays, weathered by the heat and wind, moistened by the clouds of the rainy season, easily wither and rot away. In the same way, when a practitioner dwells devoting oneself to the development of wise awareness, one's unskillful mental tendencies easily wither and rot away. I really like that naturalistic description of how freedom arises. And this is like humility, like trusting humility, trying it on, experimenting with it, and then it really becomes, over time, more and more and more the default way forward of life. And it wears out. Nothing really works as well as humility. Fixed views, however seemingly appropriate they are, fixed views are always a pain because we have to defend them. And they don't actually line up. They never line up with nature, which is not fixed. Nature, by its very nature, is unfixed. It's open. It's fluid. It doesn't lend itself to a concept, a conceiving. Even the Buddha's teachings, which of course are concepts or conceptions, are not to be clung to. A lot of you know that powerful simile where the Buddha relates or says that his teachings, these practices that most of us do, they're like a raft we use to cross the flood. That's another image of this mental proliferation, this tendency to think about stuff and get attached and fixated on our thoughts about things or views and opinions. We use these teachings and practices to cross the flood, but we don't cling to the teachings and practices. When you get across the flood, you appreciate the raft that got you there, but you don't grab it and pick it up and carrying it around. That's what the Buddha said in that discourse. You leave the raft there. It did its job. You don't have to cling to anything, including the wisdom of these teachings. We need to use these teachings and use these practices like the teaching around humility. So I'll just end with a short poem by this wonderful Persian poet from around the 13th century, Hafiz, kind of in the same school culture as Rumi, slightly less popular than Rumi these days, but a really powerful poet and spiritual teacher, Hafiz. What is the difference between your experience of existence and that of a saint? The saint knows that the spiritual path is a sublime chess game with God, and that the beloved has just made such a fantastic move that the saint is now continually tripping over joy and bursting out in laughter and saying, I surrender. Whereas, my dear, I'm afraid you still think you have 1,000 serious moves. Always makes me laugh. So nice to be with everybody today. I know that Patrice Kausch will be teaching a half-day retreat coming up in a couple of weeks, a Saturday. I believe it's Saturday afternoon, something like the 5th of September. And there's a new Buddhist studies class starting, I believe, the second Monday in September, an 8-week class on the Four Noble Truths that I'll be teaching. And other programs are coming up as well this afternoon. If you'd like to join in, there's going to be a community conversation for people who identify as male or masculine. And we're in particular discussing together. It's although there be teachers there, it's not really a workshop as much as a community conversation led by 6 wise guys in our community. And we'll be talking about the roots of aggression and dominance and violence, and what that has to do with embodying masculinity and maleness at this time, this place. So join in for that conversation. It begins at 12:30 in about 45 minutes. You can find the link for that on our website on the calendar. Take care, everybody. Wishing you a good week.